Thanks, Pierre. Thanks for that introduction. Yeah, so I'm just going to share my thoughts how I prepare for audits, both as a QP and as an auditor. Um, and the first thing I do when I'm preparing for audit, I always try to remember why I'm doing it. Like, and keeping to what Pierre said about patient safety at the forefront. So, like when there was an article in the news there recently, BBC, where there was a little girl treated with a gene therapy, because she was born deaf, and she would have been deaf if she wasn't treated with this gene therapy. But that was an infusion of a gene therapy into the cochlea of her ear, and at the time, I was thinking the confidence that those parents had that their little baby could be injected with this medicine that would fix her. That's based on the audits, based on the regulations, based on the GMP that we have. So that's the reason we're doing these audits. So that's kind of the primary motivator for auditing. But then when I'm doing an audit and preparing, I always ensure to make sure that the purpose of the audit is appropriate, or keep that in mind of why I'm doing the audit. Is it to support a QP declaration? And if that's the case, the audit report needs to ensure that there's inspection of all of the unit operations, all of the facilities, mention the product that you're inspecting for, and cover all of the quality system to show that there's adequate GMP there to support a safe, effective product. And then also, if you're doing an audit for supplier qualification, an audit of an API site, I do try and keep in mind as well that these audit reports are frequently asked for by health authorities when they're inspecting. And one of the last slides I'll show, I'll go through some of the observations that health authorities have had on audit reports. So yeah, keeping the expectations in mind of why we're doing an audit, that's the one thing I start with when preparing. When I was putting this slide together, I was really tempted to put the time, scope, cost triangle from project management. I didn't, because what I was thinking was, when you're preparing for an audit, the two major challenges you have are scope and time. So you want to see as much as you can. You want to, I could spend days, I could spend weeks on sites auditing, but that's not realistic. You get a certain number of days. Depending on the facility you're going to, you'll have an audit team with you, and you need to make sure that you're focusing on the most important parts that could impact patient safety, hazards to patient safety, that they're focused and appropriately inspected so that you can support the GMP and ensure that it's a safe product. So in order to do that, you're going to need to request the technical information. If you can get your hands on the product dossier, if it's a clinical trial, the IMPD, and take a look at the critical quality attributes, the critical process parameters, so that you can gear your agenda, that you're ensuring you meet those things. That kind of information. So yeah, also important, if it's a requalification audit, that you have the previous audit report, you see what the previous findings were, because you're going to need to check up on those previous findings and ensure the CAPAs are implemented. And then familiarization with the current regulations. So later on, I'll go through that in the next slide. One tip that I have for preparation in terms of trying to manage time is using the audit agenda to your advantage. So I just have a sample one up here where you're stepping out the scope. You can put in the number of regulations you're looking at, the site that you're going to. What I try to do with an agenda is provide it as detailed as possible. So that helps with time management. Listing out all the quality systems, listing out all of the rooms and the tour. If you're going to need to go on site, I think it's very rare that, especially with a manufacturing facility, that remote audit would be suitable, depending on the facility. If it's an audit of a office, perhaps you could do a remote audit. You'd need to do a risk assessment to ensure that you can capture everything remote. But yeah, you're going to need to go on site, and I'd always start with open a meeting and then tour. And in the tour, try and detail all of the rooms that you do want to see. So if you have, it could be a CMO with multiple different products and different rooms dedicated to different products. So you want to make sure that they're aware of exactly what you want to go and see, so that they're prepared, and there's no confusion when you come on site to do the audit. And also listing out all the quality systems, because sometimes I'll end up using the audit agenda as a checklist, and as I'm sitting there in the room ticking off to ensure I have covered everything that I do need to cover. There's always a disclaimer on the audit agenda, because having a fixed defined timeline of what you want to see is great, but things change. As you go in on the opening meeting and you go through the audit agenda, it might be the case that there's an SME that you do need to talk to who gets an urgent medical appointment and they need to be gone in the afternoon. So as an auditor, it's important to flex and ensure that you inspect or meet with the experts that can give you assurance of the different facilities that you're going to see. So an example here would be you're wanting to look at the HVAC system in clean rooms. It's, that's a critical contamination control requirement. And if you're speaking to, let's say, a quality person who is not the expert in it, they may be giving you incorrect information, not purposely, but just based on understanding. You then give them an observation and it turns out actually no, what you were told was not correct. So it's best to try and speak to the experts, get down the floor, speak to the operators, and get the assurance of the true operations. So on the next slide, Pierre, I have scope. And I'm just showing the different types of facilities that you can go to. And the bottom arrow here, we have duration and scope of the audit will differ depending on the criticality and complexity. So that's, it's risk management. If you're going to a manufacturing facility, if it's, let's say, a biologic, and you're going to look at upstream and downstream, you'll want a number of days and you'll want a team of auditors who are experienced in that operation in order to adequately observe and record all the details that you need. If perhaps you're just going to a warehouse or a distribution site, perhaps one day one auditor is sufficient. You won't be in the warehouse all day. You'll look at warehouse and then quality systems. So scope in your audit appropriate to what you need to do. Having said that, if it's a for cause, you may want to add extra days in. If you're going to look at critical observations, you need to scope to based on criticality. And also time is always my enemy when it comes to audits. I'd love to spend loads of time. So if you're going to a GMP manufacturer with clean rooms, ensure you have adequate time in your agenda for gowning up and getting into those clean rooms. It takes time to go through all the different levels of garbing and hand washing. And it can work both ways. If you're going to that type of facility, make sure you're prepared and you're not going and have to remove makeup, remove nail varnish. You know what you're going to. So just use all the tricks to try and facilitate make the most of your time when you're going to audit. On the next slide, then I go through the regulations. So in audit preparation, I don't start reading from the regulations top to bottom every time. Far from it. But as a qualified auditor, when you're certified as an auditor, you have to maintain your continual professional development, and that's keeping up to speed on the current regulations. There's constant updates of these regulations, so you need to be aware of what the updates are. Separately, as a QP, there's that CPD, the continual professional development obligation as well. So you're looking at the regulations day by day, like it's part of the day job when you look at the regulations, so you're familiar with them. Similarly, if you're working on a manufacturing site, you're getting the GMP refresher training annually, which will cover the different EMA chapters. So you almost absorb them working on a manufacturing site, and as you're walking around a facility, like they're transcribed into your SOPs, so you're aware of them. So it's not as if you're starting from scratch. So as a qualified auditor, as I said, you need to be aware of them. As part of your qualification, you will have gone through that. In one of my previous companies, to qualify as an auditor, there was I think it was a 200 question multiple choice in order to qualify as an auditor. So that was good to be assured that the approved auditors were fully qualified. I'll just point to a few of these here. It's not an all-encompassing list. It's just some of the ones that I would use. From EMA, obviously we have our chapters and our different annexes depending on the product. But let's say if you're a newer auditor or less experienced in the manufacturing floor, I find the Q&A is really good for interpretation of some of the guidelines, because they can be quite high level, and unless you're on the floor daily and in different facilities, knowing how they're to be interpreted and implemented, it mightn't fully come across from just reading them off the cuff. But the EMAs go into application and interpretation, so they're really useful. There's checklists for audits, really helpful. ICH, I would consult ICH depending on where it's going. So if I was going to a stability site, I'd probably take a look at Q5, and the relevant ICH, that's not a guideline I'd look at day by day. So I would refresh myself on that depending on the site I was going to. ISPE, I've put that in there. It's an engineering guide. They've some really good regulations. And in particular, there can be some that aren't necessarily specific to pharma, but are inherently part of pharma. So within warehouses, we're all aware that you need to use heat-treated wood pallets. And the reason for that is to stop the spread of mold. So that's one part of your contamination control strategy. But why? It's actually an EU regulation based on the ISPEs, and it's not pharma specific, it's for all products, and it's to try and stop the spread of mold worldwide as goods are being transported. So if you did see, crates done up and they're not heat treated, and even observation unique to site something, you could use that particular regulation. Although most companies would have that requirement in their receipt checklist or their SOP. HPRA, then there's some really good guidance on there, and their newsletters are good. FDA, what I mostly look at there are the recent 483s that they publish and warning letters, because it will give you an indication of the culture in that jurisdiction, and maybe that jurisdiction has a particular interpretation or a particular benchmark for the regulations, and just to be aware of, constant findings where there may be weaknesses in some of the quality systems. ECA is a great resource. There's checklists there as well. So yeah, I won't go through them all, but just to point out that that's what I would use in preparation, and I would consult them to know where they are. So when I was saying, you've done your annual GMP, we all know that you can't have food on a manufacturing floor, but sometimes people will make the mistake, or somebody wins an Easter egg. And it happened one time, I went down to the warehouse and there was an Easter egg sitting on the desk, and the person hadn't been thinking of it as food. So this was a desk in the warehouse of a finished product, medicinal product. Because it was their prize, they hadn't think, oh, this is food, I can't have it in the warehouse. So, it was just an omission error, but to cite that observation, where is that? It's a chapter 1, it's a chapter 2. So that's the reason, just to be able to consult the regulations and cite the appropriate regulation if you do come across observations. So on the next slide, then I have hazards and time and scope. I think I'm repeating the same message here. Time is my enemy when I come to audits. I'd love to spend loads of time when I can, so I really need to pull myself back and make sure I'm focusing on the most important things. And one of the things that I do to help with that is to prepare as much as possible, read as much as possible, request the technical information, get as much information as possible. And since the pandemic, companies are great at setting up bridges, setting up SharePoints to share information in advance. I have my old friend Benjamin Franklin there, and he came out with preparing to fail is failing to prepare is preparing to fail. So I think that's really, really true for audits. You really need to put the effort into preparation, as much into preparation almost as into execution. And then I mentioned earlier, keeping in mind, audit reports that you do, who's your audience for them. HPRA had an information there. It was information day back in May 22. And they gave a report of, their most frequent findings of different sites that they go to inspect. And one of their major deficiencies that they have given out is delayed approval of audit reports. So when you're an auditor, you need to give an audit report that has sufficient information, that's not going to need to go back and back, so that can, that there's adequate approval, that it can be issued, CAPAs interpreted, there's enough detail there for the CAPAs to be interpreted correctly, addressed correctly, and there's no time delays on that. They also gave deficiencies for not performing on-site audits. So as I mentioned before, I really think, you go into an audit, you're using all your senses, you don't realise it, but, you're going to smell the sporicidal if you're going into a clean room, or, the disinfectant. You're looking around for the facility, you're hearing different people. You don't realise what you're doing, but it's part of the nature of going and auditing. So you don't get that through watching a video. They also gave an observation where the audit report didn't detail the active substance manufacturer, so it wasn't suitable to support a QP declaration. So if an audit is not on site or doesn't have sufficient detail, QP is going to be very reluctant to put their name to a declaration that it's manufactured to GMP. And that's one of the outputs of this. They also had a GDP information day, and some of the observations from the GDP inspectors were relation to outsourced activities where audit reports just weren't sufficiently detailed. It just didn't, they were too high level, or the frequency of audit wasn't sufficient. So companies need to assign the frequency of audit on a risk-based frequency, and your more riskier suppliers are audited more frequently, so they have given observations for that. Yeah, on to my last slide then, you'll be delighted to know. So from the EMA, this was from the European QP Forum, they sent out the message that when you're doing a QP declaration, you're qualifying the auditor as much as the site. And in order to use it, you need to use an auditor who has suitable experience, the qualifications, and you need to have a contract with that auditor, with the company providing the audit as well. Because when you're looking, so when I've looked at audits and performed QP declarations, you're looking at the audit, you want to see the sufficient detail, but that audit report is only as good as the auditor that wrote it. You always get their CV alongside the audit report, and you can see, okay, well, they have lots of experience in the different areas of regulations, and they know what they're talking about. So having written the audit report up, you're happy enough to use that to declare that the product's manufactured to GMP. So that is me, Pierre.
Thank you, Eleanor. That was really interesting.